So here we are with Kathy Vargas. I'm Brookes Ebetsch on the 23rd of March here at the Institute for Latino Studies. We're doing a show of her work, and so we have the privilege of getting to talk to her a little today. Kathy, hi.
Hello.
I want to talk to you a little bit first just about photo in general. What is it that draws you to photo? How did you choose photo as opposed to everything else?
Well, for one thing, I was a really bad painter. I knew I wanted to make art, and I didn't have any ideas in painting. I think that's what it came down to. And I always think that artists are really driven by their ideas more than by whatever they can accomplish technically or whatever God-given skills they have. And my ideas came when I picked up a camera, my connection with the world and all of that. So that's how I was first drawn to photography.
So what was your first camera?
Actually, an Instamatic. Well, actually, if you go way back, when I was about 5, I had one of those little Diana point-and-shoot cameras, those little plastic cameras. And then I used the family Brownie for a number of years. I was the family photographer because my mother always cut people's heads off and my dad had no interest. And then later I had a little Instamatic, and that was actually what I took my first photo class with. I had a very strange first photo teacher who was a rock and roll photographer, and he believed in the unorthodox, and it was the 70s. So it was at a time when people were making, it was post-Robert Frank, so it was at a time when people were making strange, blurry photographs. And so having an Instamatic was fine with him. And I liked it. I liked the alchemy of watching the photos come up in the darkroom. And so after I realized I really liked it and it really was my medium, then I went out and got a decent camera.
So when was the first time you thought of double exposing your negatives? Was that an accident, or did you purposely say, yes, this is what I want to look like?
Actually, it was an assignment. It was an assignment in a class. I was taking a 4x5 class. And one of the assignments was to do a double exposure. And I had been reading Garcia Marquez, and I had always read Einstein. And so it was this whole idea of the layering of time and the fact that time was not a linear concept. And so when I did the first double exposures, I thought, oh my God, here's the visual enactment of all of that thinking I've been doing. And all of the thinking about the past coming up through the present and family memories coming up through my own realities, layering of culture, layering of time, specifically layering of experiences. And I thought, okay, this is it. Never look back.
Well, so since I love photo, and I always look at your work and I think, oh my Lord, how long does it take her to finally get that one shot that looks right? Because, you know, you really stress that you're not, it's all in camera, there's no sandwiching. Did it take you years? Do you have a system now and you just know you put it like this and it'll all come out great?
Not, more or less. It's still all a happy accident, which is what I like about doing it in the camera versus doing it in the computer. Because some of it has to be happy accident. Some of it has to come from the subconscious. Of course, some of it is very conscious. The technical aspects are very conscious. I know if I expose this for half a second versus exposing this for a full second, this is going to be stronger, therefore this is going to be the dominant thing. This is going to be coming up more subtly. And so I know a lot of times what I want to stress, what I want the emphasis on. I want the emphasis on this thing, therefore I'm going to give it a longer exposure. But at the same time, there are little happy accidents that happen. Flowers across someone's face that I hadn't planned on. And so it's a combination of the two. It's thought out, it's planned. Some of it is predictable, but some of it is always going to be unpredictable.
Can you talk to me a little bit about your subjects and how you choose the different series you do and why you work in series so much?
Well, one idea flows into the other, but one photograph is never enough. So that's why I work in series. It's generally an idea that takes a while to become completely clear. It's kind of like the double exposure itself. It may not be apparent the first time you shoot it, or it may only be a hint at something. And the idea is still at the back of your mind. The idea is still waking you up in the morning. It's the bottom line. And so for me, it's a matter of how often am I going to come back to this idea? How long is it going to stay fresh? And when do I feel that I've finally said what I need to say? I'll be working along on something, like the family series that I just finished. And I'll be reading. And I'll be reading different books. And I'll realize that different books or different verbal thoughts impact what I'm thinking about. And so there'll be another aspect. Oh, it should be arranged like this. Oh, it should have this type of a follow-through. Or, oh, it should have this kind of spacer in between, so that I have the family photos, but then I have the discontinuous spacing in between them. And so things begin to unfurl, in a sense, slowly. I work in series because I'm not done with an idea with one shot. I want to keep thinking about it. I want to keep dwelling on it. And it takes as long as it takes. Some series I can do in a couple of months, and some series take 4 or 5 years. I'll be working on different series at the same time and thinking about them in different ways and having different things impact them.
I'm interested to know more about the snapshots that appear in a lot of your work that are these family photos. And for the first thing that came to mind when you said that was, talked about your family and your mom cutting off people's heads was, well, then how do you get all these good photos?
Because they're of her, not by her.
Are most of the photos you use from your family, or are these things you find?
Oh, no. Some of them are things that I direct. When I was doing the I Was Little thing, that's not me as a child. That is a friend's daughter. I didn't have a photograph of me expressed in that way that I could draw from. So I could envision in my head, in my mind's eye, how I felt when I was little. And so I had to have someone else enact it. But the more recent images, the Este Recuerdo, is actually my family, and it's going way back, as far back as I can go, to my family history. Some of it is possible, it's possible to find photos of. Some of it, like when my great-great-grandfather first got here, photography hadn't been invented yet, or actually when he first got to Tejas, because it was Tejas, not Texas, it was 1830. It was before the Alamo, and it was 9 years before photography. So there weren't any pictures of him as a young man, so in that sense I have to recreate them. I have to imagine them, find a model who I think looks the way he would have looked, and recreate them. But then when he was much older, there were photos of him, so I could use an actual photo. My grandfather, my grandmother, all of those folks, there were actual photos of. And it's interesting, it was interesting for me to work with them, because when my mother died, she was the last of the older generation to pass away. There were boxes and boxes of photos left, and since I was an only child, I didn't have to split them up with anyone. They were all mine. And I think it was a double reason for me to work with them. The first was that we think we know our parents, but we never really do. And so all of these people, all of these elders, were still a riddle to me, what their lives had actually been like. There were stories I knew and stories I didn't know. And so for me, looking into their faces one last time was a way to try to solve their riddles. And then sharing them with other people was a way of saying, we all have these stories that are riddles, that are about the people we know and love too well to know completely. And so where are your family histories, and how are they similar? And where are your stories? And go dig out your family photos and look into their faces. And also a way of saying they exist, because a lot of our families, and not just Latino families, all of our families, are not going to make it into the history books. They're going to live lovely, giving, loving, anonymous lives. And so it was one way to take them out of anonymity.
How do you think the juxtaposition of snapshots in a much more manipulated fine art photography setting works, especially when it's seen in like a gallery setting?
For me, it was a matter of placing them in the context of the grave. And they had died recently. I was dealing with that passage, and so the textures of stone, the images of grass and flowers, were this way of saying they have passed away, but they're still alive in memory. And so that's the way they work for me. It's snapshots, and it's snapshots that I have that are ways of remembering them, but it's also a way of reminding myself and reminding everybody else, these lives are done now. These lives that opened the doors for us, these lives that gave us stability, that gave us comfort, they're gone now. And so I think the whole idea of snapshots has been looked at over and over in the history of photography. From the day that it was possible to make snapshots on. A lot of different people have dealt with snapshots. Certainly conceptual people have dealt with this idea of rephotographing their family snapshots and recontextualizing them. And that's basically what I was doing. It falls into that history of conceptual recontextualizing, but it also falls into the cultural realm of recontextualizing people that aren't normally seen.
When I look at your work, I see a very feminine touch to everything.
Yeah.
What do you see in yours? How would you describe what you do, your technique to people?
Technically, it's double exposures done in a 4x5 camera, selenium split toned and then hand colored. I have always, it's funny because before I got into trouble for doing Latino work, I got into trouble for doing women's work. I think in a sense the women's movement came maybe pretty much at the same time as the Chicano art movement, but maybe a little bit in advance as far as the mainstream was concerned. It hit the mainstream first, and it argued and fought with the mainstream first, that idea of women's work, which happened in the early 70s. Chicano work was happening at the same time, but it wasn't going to confront the mainstream until literally a couple of years later. And so when I was in graduate school, you have to remember I was in San Antonio and everything hit San Antonio about 10 years behind the times. So when I was in graduate school in the early 80s, the first thing I got in trouble for was putting lace in my photos. And so, you work with who you are. You can't get away with who you are. You can't get away from your own experiences. You can get away with who you are, but you can't get away from it. And so I was trying to get away with who I was. And part of that was being female. And part of that was that I wasn't going to make the same type of work that, say, a male, Latino or not, would have made in my place. And so, yeah, a lot of it has to do with women's subject matter. A lot of it has to do with cultural subject matter. A lot of it also has to do with the mainstream influence. I always remind people that I am as influenced by rock and roll and Robert Frank as I am by culture and being a woman. So it's all part of the mix. It's all in there.
Do you consciously put yourself into your work, or do you think it's just something within this redefining your family and discovering that happens?
I don't know if it's conscious. I think it's more just something that happens. I think it's something that I can't avoid and therefore haven't tried to avoid. Even when I was doing documentary work, I was photographing in my own neighborhood. I wasn't going to some other place to photograph. I was comfortable, in a sense I was comfortable in my own skin and I was comfortable in my own neighborhood. And so that's where I went to photograph. And so for me it's normal to be myself in my photographs.
So I read recently that you live in the house that you grew up in, and it was your grandmother's house too before then?
Well, my grandmother lived with my parents when I was growing up, and so she lived in that house. It wasn't necessarily her house, but she lived in that house for a long time.
So what makes you stay in San Antonio? Lots of people say, "Oh my gosh, get out of there! You've been there so long." But what roots you there? What do you love about San Antonio?
Everything. I have, because I've lived there for so long, I have a lot of friends there. I don't want to sound like an ad for San Antonio, but the cost of living is wonderful for artists. There is a relatively healthy, thriving art scene. There's a lot of freedom for artists in that artists do their own thing there. If they want to open their living room and call it a gallery, they do. If they want to work with Latino art organizations, they can. If they want to work with African American art organizations, they can. If they want to work with mainstream organizations, they can. It's kind of like everybody kind of navigates the same terrain. It's small enough that you can do that, and yet it's large enough that you can do a lot of different things. You don't have to stay pigeonholed. If you want to try video, you can try video. If you want to try writing, you can try writing. And so, and there are wonderful networks there. The writers talk to the artists talk to the musicians. So I have a lot of friends who are both artists and have bands. And so it's very flexible, it's very comfortable. It's not tightly defined. and maybe that's what keeps me there.
So who are some of the people that you've chosen to work with, or organizations?
Well, the Guadalupe, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I was there for 15 years. The Carver Cultural Center, which is the African American arts organization. It's a wonderful place. I had some of my first shows there. Of course, I'm at University of the Incarnate Word now, which is a very nice place. But then there are a number of other different places. Blue Star is there, and it's a very, very mainstream place. You know, kind of rocky getting it off the ground because it's kind of like pummeling on the doors to get Latinos in. But that's happened now, and it happens. And maybe that's the thing with Sanitary. I think the reason I stayed, if I was going to have moved, I would have moved when I was in my mid to late 30s. And there was too much to do there when I was in my mid to late 30s. There were a lot of doors that had to be opened for Latinos, a lot of places that they couldn't access. And so we started pummeling on the doors. And once we got the doors open, it's like, okay, things are cool now, why leave? So it was a matter of finally feeling comfortable at home.
So speaking of opening doors, you just recently were appointed to be the Texas 2D Artist of the Year.
Yeah.
What was that like for you, and what did you get to do, and how did that feel? I mean,
Well, I think the appointment itself was the most interesting thing. I guess the main thing is, okay, don't screw up and do anything to embarrass Texas. Was the most important thing. You know, to have some shows. I spoke at a conference that the governor's wife, the First Lady of Texas, gave, so that was nice. And that was interesting because I got to give a talk on censorship in the arts and not censoring the arts, which is an interesting thing in this day and age. An old issue for me. The main thing that we did is we went to Texas Congress, and we shook hands with a lot of senators and congressmen. And that was kind of scary, you know. And that was the main thing. It was, it was similar to what I've done before, except that this time I was invited instead of yelling at them. So I wasn't yelling at them for more funding. I wasn't yelling at them to stop doing something horrible. This time I was an invited guest, so that was kind of nice. It's funny because I love rock and roll, and Eric Clapton was at one point given a prestigious award, and he went up to receive it, and he said, "This is the Dinosaur Award. If you survive for a certain length of time, then they will give you something to recognize the fact of your survival." And that's kind of the way it felt. I felt it was kind of like, not quite the Dinosaur Award, but it was, in a sense, for all of us, for all of those of us who were recognized because it was a Texas musician and all of that. It was a way of saying, okay, we recognize that you have managed to hang in there and you've managed to keep doing your work. And I think, in a sense, I think that's the nicest thing somebody can say, is that you're still around and we still want to look at what you have to say. That was nice.
did you feel like you were well received when you were talking to everybody about censorship and everything?
Yeah, actually it was interesting because it was, for me it was a mild censorship talk. It wasn't a beat them over the head with it. It was, it was the same lecture I give to my students, that they're living in an age of censorship, that we had censorship in the 1950s. But I was born in 1950, so I kind of missed that. By the time I was a conscious being, it was pretty much gone. And then I grew up in the 60s where nothing was censored and everybody knew everything, and everything was exploding with all sorts of information. Photographs were very important. Photographs of the Vietnam War, photographs of Kent State were very, very important as far as telling people the truth. And they made it onto the pages of the papers and they changed people's minds. And then all of a sudden, in 1990, we have the National Endowment for the Arts being censored. We have the NEA 4 happening, people having their grants taken away because they were talking about being lesbian or being gay or any one of a number of things. Now there's political censorship. I talk to my students, too, about the fact that that one photograph of all the coffins coming back from Iraq was censored. I remember the morning I heard about that. I remember that I was watching some TV news show that I always watched before going to work, and they were saying photographs had been censored of the dead bodies coming back from Iraq, and I hadn't seen the photo, and I had images of something very graphic. I had a mental image of the horrific mutilation that might have happened to soldiers in time of war. And I thought, wow, well, You know, I didn't think it should have been censored, but I thought, well, that would be hard to look at. Because I was thinking of the Civil War photos. I was thinking of the photos in the 1860s of the Civil War dead. And then I saw this beautiful color image of flag-draped coffins. And I thought, why would anyone object to this? And still, there was this story that the government had tried to censor the image. And the government had tried to censor the image because there were too many coffins. And I thought, that's it? There were too many coffins? You didn't want us to know that there were a lot of coffins? Beautiful wood, respectfully treated. The coffins were carried off the plane with every ounce of respect affordable to someone who had died in a war. Flag draped, the whole thing. And you were censoring them because there were too many? And I think, more than anything, I realized we live in an age of censorship. We also live in an age of political correctness. There are certain images that I can't show my students because they might be offended. And if they're offended, I can be charged with harassment. And in photography, this is a very big deal. Some of the best images in the history of photography are very, very offensive. And then again, we start thinking about what's offensive. I can show the Matthew Brady photos of the Civil War and the Confederate dead contorted into all sorts of horrific positions. But I can't show Joel Peter Witkin. I can't show some of the Sally Mann photos because they're children. I can't show Nan Golden because it talks about alternative sexual orientation. And so you begin to think about all of these different concepts of how we live with our censorship. We live with our censorship because of political correctness. We live with our censorship because of people being maybe offended by differing religious views. I can't show Piss Christ. And so I always tell my students, you guys live in an age of censorship. Back to the lecture I gave. The lecture I gave was not tear down the houses of power. The lecture I gave was question, question, question. Why? And what am I not seeing? And why am I supposed to be offended by this? What in my makeup would offend me? I went to a talk that Andres Serrano gave once. And it was funny, we had it at the Guadalupe, and I was one of the people who fought to host it. And we had a man calling up, and he wanted to be sure he was going to be offended. He wanted to know if Serrano was going to show Piss Christ, and I said, I can't promise you he will. He's got a huge, many different bodies of work, and I don't know what he's going to show. He said, well, I want to know that if I go, that, he wanted to be angry. He wanted to be angered by what he considered was the primo censorable subject matter. And I went to the lecture and saw the Piss Christ, saw a number of his different, saw the ejaculate series, saw a number of different things, and then saw a very beautiful series he did of portraits of the Ku Klux Klan. And I thought, if I was going to be offended, that's what would offend me. Such beautiful representations of the Klan. That's what would offend me. However, even though I might be offended, that doesn't mean I don't want other people to see them. And I just want the same thing. When I think about censorship, I think I want the same respect, that I'm enough of an adult to be able to take whatever is visually given to me. And I don't want my muse changed. I don't want to not be able to see the bodies of the people who died from wounds due to apartheid. I don't want to be able to not see the bodies of that disappeared in Latin America and not know those realities because I might be offended. So that's my whole take on censorship is, don't deprive me of any information. I'll let you know when I need to go throw up over something. And even if I do, that's my business.
Mm-hmm. So I know you started out taking pictures in your neighborhood, and when you're talking just now, it seems like you still have a very great love for the documentary style work and a great respect for it. Oh, yeah. Do you ever just get the urge to go outside with your camera and take some more pictures? Actually,
every now and then I do. But then I work them back into I actually have been doing, I just started a new series on missing children, because we get those cards, you know, it's at 1-800-THE LOST, which is always such a sad thing for me to think about, children, the lost. A lot of times it's family abductions, you know, a dad will take them away from a mom or vice versa. Sometimes it's actual stranger abductions. And you get these things and you wonder where these kids are. And so I've started working with this idea of happy childhoods, which is some of the work that you guys just got, 2 of the happy childhoods. And then now going back and recontextualizing the images of the lost childhoods. And I actually met a man when I was in New Mexico who gave me one of his baby pictures to work with. I haven't done it yet. Who was one of those people who was abducted by his dad and taken away from his mom. And finally, when he was 18, went back and found his mom again. And trying to deal with those family stories, and also dealing with children who have been neglected and abused and even drastically hurt, physically hurt and emotionally hurt, scarred by their families, by their own kin. There's a huge rash of it happening all over the country. And so it's very, you know, it's a different kind of violence. It's violence inflicted upon children, which is unimaginable because they can't speak, they can't run away. They can't get up and walk away and say, I'm going to get a job and get away from you. You know, they can't do that. And sometimes they don't even know when they're being abused. They think this is normal because they don't have anything to compare it to. And so a lot of times what I've been doing lately is going to a kiddie park and photographing the empty rides. Just the idea that there's something missing in some childhoods, that joy is gone, that joy is missing. So I've been taking my little Diana camera, actually, and going out into the world and photographing in shadowed context these little empty rides that children go on, that little children go on. And so sometimes I still go out into the world. I still want to go out, but I understand for me, and this is also something that happens in documentary photography, ever since Robert Frank, who I love, there's been that impulse to do the personal photography in documentary work. So I understand for me that these are a personal take, that I know what I'm doing. I know I want a certain shadowing, a certain visual impact, even with the kiddie rides. So I know that's what I'm looking for. So even when I'm doing documentary, what passes for documentary, I know that it's with my own slant. But I will take the camera out there and catch the real world.
Are there other contemporary issues that you're working on these days?
Not specifically. I tend to wander into one thing at a time. And so right now I'm wandering through childhood. So that's it for now.
What kind of things do you read? You've talked a whole lot about these different, you always read Einstein, and that's how you got this time idea.
Yeah.
And a lot of your...
And Stephen Hawking.
And a lot of your images have begun to incorporate more text.
Yeah.
So what kind of things do you read? Do you read newspapers every
Oh,
day?
yeah.
Do you read literature? What are you interested in?
Everything. I read newspapers. I read Time. I read Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, whatever I can get my hands on. I'm always carrying something around. Novels, lots and lots of novels from lots of different cultures. I love Japanese writers. And I've been reading a lot of the Chinese authors, new Chinese authors, new Japanese, but some of the historic people from about World War II forward. Kawabata, Akutagawa are some of my favorites. I can't remember his name, but I keep wanting to say Murakami, something like that. Just finished a new one, Kafka on the Shore by him. Amazing book. And magic realism. It's funny because there is a trend towards magic realism that's cross-cultural, that is prevalent in a lot of the new Japanese writers. It also is obviously prevalent in the Latin American writers. Lots of Latin American writers, lots of women writers, lots of stuff about the Dominican Republic from the time of the end of the Trujillo regime through the present, actually through it and then through the present. So interesting things that are historically based, but that take it in a different direction, take it in a personal direction. I guess that's what's interesting for me, is how individuals survive in difficult historical realities.
Speaking of this relationship between the literature and the imagery. You recently participated in a project with
Yeah.
Oz for the NEA. Speaking of the NEA before as
Yeah.
well. Tell me what that experience was like for you.
That was really great because I met a new writer, and so I always like meeting new writers. It was interesting because I read her poetry. It was Valerie Martinez. I read her poetry, and I thought, should I call her? And I thought, no, I don't. I want to. Again, it's the personal. I want to come to my own interpretation of it. And I read a lot of her pieces, and it wasn't any one specific piece. They began to merge in and out of each other. I liked her. It was a good pairing. I want to say it was a good pairing. I really liked her work because she leaves a lot of space for the reader. So she's not saying, this is what you must know or this is what you must feel when you read my work. It's as if she's indirectly hinting at an experience. And then you can bring your own experience, and there's lots of room to merge with hers. And so that was really nice. And I've always been enthralled with Day of the Dead, not only the feast itself, but the memories that come with it. The fact that on All Souls Day, when I was a little girl, that was the day you sat and talked about all of the deceased members of the family, the great aunts and the great uncles and the great-great-grandmother and the great-great-great-grandmother, and who was indigenous and who was French and who was this and who was that. So you had a sense of history, you know. That's how I learned that I had a great uncle who was a ceramic artist, and I, you know, had an uncle somewhere else who actually was a photographer. And it was a day to bring the family together. And so when I read her piece, when I read Invocation, she was calling forth the dead. She was saying, come forward and be recognized. And at the same time, I had a good friend who was dying of AIDS. And I thought, someday he's going to be one of the people who is called forward to be recognized, because the friends, it's not just family, the friends come forward too. And so it was the idea of letting him come forward to be recognized. He was also a writer. He is also a writer, and writes plays and writes some poetry. And I thought, well, this is fitting. This is a nice circle, that a writer will compel me to call forward another writer who is also a good friend and who won't be with us too much longer.
Does spirituality usually come into your work in some sense?
Yeah, it does. I grew up with it. It comes very naturally. It comes very natural. I have all sorts of questions. It's funny, I remember when I was interviewing for my job at Incarnate Word, I probably scared the heck out of the poor nun I was interviewing with. She was in charge of mission. And I asked her, it just something that I've been dealing with, the idea of angels. And I asked her, I said, okay, there were X amount of souls when the world was first made, and we're all supposed to have a guardian angel. So does that mean that God keeps making new angels? Because that means the creation is ongoing. And if you only started out with 2 people, and then there were 2 more people, and then there were 8 people, and then there were 28 people, and then there were 128 people, and God must be having to make more angels if we're each going to have at least one guardian angel. And it was something, you know, she probably looked at me like, what are you talking about? But for me, it was a bigger question. The issue wasn't so much about angels. The issue was, is creation ongoing? If I'm an artist, and then there are other artists, and maybe we started out with 10 artists, but now we have 100,000 artists. Creation has to be ongoing. Creation is not just in God's hands anymore. And the artists aren't just artists. The artists are scientists, and the artists are architects, and the artists are engineers, and the artists are the people who fabricate the world in which we live. Artists are politicians. And so creation is ongoing. And so spirituality becomes a very personal thing, because we are all a part of the ongoing process of creation. And we all recreate the world in our own image. And so in a sense it goes back and forth. Whoever, whatever God is, we're charged with being a part of that deity.
So where are you working these days? What's your studio like? Where is it? 'Cause I had read you were in transition between all these things. Where are you now?
I'm still in the dark room, or I'm trying to be. I have to find more paper. I have to find, the silver processes, a lot of them are going by the wayside, and so a lot of the people who make photographic paper are going into bankruptcy. It's funny because somebody was telling me recently that Sally Mann has said, I'm really glad that I learned how to sensitize my own paper and make my own materials, because that's what I have to do, that's what I'll do. And, you know, the thing is, I never say never. I keep thinking, okay, if digital is the only way I can work, then I'll go digital. It'll be different, and I'll have to really fight to try to pull out what I need from it, because right now I'm not seeing what I need from it. That's the bottom line. I'm not seeing what I need from that process. But if that's what I need to do, then that's what I'll do. You find a different way to say things, and you find different things to say. Actually, I've been thinking maybe I should venture into video, which might be a more like a moving picture type of a thing. Might be something that I want to do. Mm-hmm. If I was to go digital, I think I'd go video digital rather than still image digital. Mm-hmm. And that could be interesting to overlap images in video. But that's, you know, whatever I do in the darkroom, I understand that I'm also working in the world, you know. I have a friend, new friend, who, you know, tried to go volunteer at the SAM shelter, which is our homeless shelter, and he was told he could only come volunteer if he was part of a group. And so he now wants to form a group so he can be a group, so we may go do that. And it's funny because I think that's the thing about being a studio artist, is I don't take my camera with me when I go into the world unless it's a very conscious thing. But one thing nourishes the other. And so if I'm an artist in the studio, then I'm also an artist in the world. It goes back to that ongoing process of creativity. And so if I go to the SAM shelter, there will be some artistry required for that. But it won't be with a camera. It won't be, let's take pictures of the homeless. It will be, let's live that experience, and then let's see how that feeds the art I make.
Well, Kathy, we really look forward to seeing these new adventures and these new experiences for you. I want to thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today.
Thank you.